Beginning in 1964, conservatives had argued that state governments, businesses, and individuals needed more freedom from the heavy hand of federal government. By 1980, under Democrat leadership, government spending on entitlement programs that provide guaranteed benefits to certain groups, was nearly $300 billion annually. Some people had also become frustrated with the government's civil rights policies, which had begun as a movement to provide equal opportunities, but now appeared to discriminate against others. From 1932 to 1976, Democrats won 8 of 12 presidential elections. The two Republican presidents, Eisenhower and Nixon, had Democratic Congresses that prevented them from asserting a conservative agenda. As the 1970s progressed, right-wing grassroots support groups across the country emerged to support and promote single issues that reflected their key interest. These groups collectively became known as the New Right. The New Right focused its energy on blocking the Equal Rights Amendment, evading court-ordered busing to achieve a fixed ratio of black and white students in schools, and a return to school prayer, which had been banned by the Supreme Court in 1962. Many in the New Right criticized affirmative action, which required employers to give special consideration to women, African Americans, and other minority groups in their hiring practices. Conservatives saw affirmative action as a form of reverse discrimination, favoring one group over another on the basis of race or gender. Eventually, these conservative groups formed the Conservative Coalition, an alliance of business leaders, middle-class voters, disaffected Democrats, and fundamentalist Christian groups. Religion, especially evangelical Christianity, played a key role in the growing strength of the Conservative Coalition. Two of the most influential televangelists were Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. Falwell formed an organization called the Moral Majority, which condemned liberal attitudes and argued for a restoration of traditional moral values in America. The right needed a candidate, and they found that candidate in Ronald Reagan. Reagan was originally a Roosevelt New Deal Democrat, but he became a conservative in the 1950s and was popularly noted for saying that he did not leave the Democratic Party. The party left him, rather, when they began to change their platform. Spokesman for the General Electric for a number of years, Reagan also campaigned for Barry Goldwater in 1964. His speeches made him a serious candidate for office, and in 1966 he ran for and was elected governor of California. He was reelected to that position in 1970. Reagan, however, lost the Republican nomination for president to Gerald Ford in 1976, but the race was extremely close, so that in 1980, when Reagan ran again, he won the won the Republican nomination for president. He ran in the election of 1980 on a number of key issues, primarily the Supreme Court decisions on abortion, pornography, and the teaching of evolution and public prayer in schools. He ran on the prolonged Iranian hostage crisis, which by the time of the election was running into 400 days of 52 Americans still being held hostage by the Iranian government, and Jimmy Carter appeared to be helpless in that situation. Reagan also ran against the weak economy and the high inflation rate under the Carter administration. Thanks to his acting career and his long experience in the public eye, Reagan was an extremely effective candidate. He became known as the Great Communicator. As his running mate, he selected George H.W. Bush, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Only 52.6% of Americans went to the polls in the 1980 election, a clear indication of their displeasure with the government and how the country was being run. Reagan won 51% of the popular vote, but his support was spread throughout the country so that he carried 44 states, winning a landslide 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49 electoral votes. Conservatives had elected one of their own. Reagan believed in less government, lower taxes, and traditional values, and he worked to translate these beliefs into public policy. As soon as he took office, Reagan worked to reduce the size and influence of the federal government. His strategy for downsizing the federal government included deep cuts in government spending on social programs. Economically, he favored supply-side economics. This theory held that if people paid fewer taxes, they would save more money. Banks could then loan more money to businesses, which in turn could invest the money in resources to improve productivity. The supply of goods would then increase, driving down prices. This became known as Reaganomics. At Reagan's urging, Congress cut income taxes by 25% over a 3-year period. At the same time, Reagan authorized increases in military spending that more than offset the cuts in social programs. Between 1981 and 1984, the Defense Department budget almost doubled. Reagan revived two controversial weapons systems programs, the MX missile and the Strategic Defensive Initiative, or SDI. SDI was a missile defense system based on satellite-mounted lasers. The program was estimated to cost trillions of dollars and quickly became known as Star Wars after a popular movie of the day. Under Reagan's economic programs, the country came out of its most severe recession in 1981 and 1982 and witnessed an economic upturn in 1983. Consumers went on a spending spree. Another means Reagan used to downsize the federal government was through deregulation, the cutting back of federal regulation of industry. He removed price controls on oil, the airline industry, and the savings and loan industry. These actions increased competition and resulted in lower prices for consumers. Beneath the surface of this recovery, however, the national debt increased dramatically. National spending still outstripped national revenue. One of the most important ways in which Reagan accomplished his conservative goals was through his appointments to the Supreme Court. Reagan nominated Antonin Scalia, Anthony Kennedy, and Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to sit on the Supreme Court, as conservative justices to the nation's highest court. President George H.W. Bush, following Reagan's 2 terms, would later make the court even more conservative with the seating of Justices David H. Souter and Clarence Thomas. The Reagan and Bush appointments to the Supreme Court ended the liberal control over the court that had begun under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In 1984, Reagan and Bush won re-election in a landslide, defeating Democrat Walter Mondale, who was vice president under Jimmy Carter, and his running mate Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman on a major party's presidential ticket. Reagan carried every state except Mondale's home state of Minnesota. In 1988, Americans were still economically comfortable, and after 2 years of Reagan as president, George H.W. Bush easily won the presidential election of '88, defeating Democrat Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts. Bush built on Reagan's legacy by promising, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Bush also benefited from a strong U.S. foreign policy under Reagan. U.S. foreign policy in the 1980s was marked by intense hostility towards the Soviet Union. Drastic economic problems within the Soviet Union destroyed its ability to continue the Cold War standoff. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the Secretary General of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. His rise to power marked the beginning of a new era in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev advocated a policy known as glasnost, which is Russian for openness. He allowed open criticism of the Soviet government and took some steps towards freedom of the press. In 1987, Gorbachev outlined his plans for perestroika, a restructuring of Soviet society. He called for less government, control of the economy, the introduction of some private enterprise, and steps towards establishing a democratic government in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's plan of action reflected the failure of the communist system. He recognized that better relations with the United States would allow the Soviets to reduce their military spending and reform their economy. Gorbachev's introduction of democratic ideas led to an increase in nationalism among the Soviet Union's non-Russian republics. In December 1991, 14 non-Russian republics declared their independence from the Soviet Union. Gorbachev himself was replaced by reformers in the Soviet Union who thought his pace toward reform was too slow. After 74 years as a world power, the Soviet Union dissolved. signaling a clear indication that communism as a form of government was a failure. In February of 1992, President George Bush Sr. and Russian President Boris Yeltsin issued a formal statement declaring an end to the Cold War. In January 1993, they signed the START II Treaty, which cut their nuclear arsenals by 75%. The collapse of the Soviet Union was accompanied by the collapse of other communist regimes. In October 1989, East Germany repudiated its communist government. The Berlin Wall opened on November 9, 1989, and by October 3, 1990, East and West Germany were reunited into one country. Czechoslovakia withdrew from the Soviet bloc. Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania declared their independence. Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania also transitioned from communism. Yugoslavia, however, collapsed. Ethnic rivalries deteriorated into a brutal civil war between Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, and Roman Catholic Croats in this country. These groups divided the country into their own spheres of influence, and Serbia backed Serb minorities that were stirring civil unrest in Croatia and Bosnia. Even before perestroika unfolded in the Soviet Union, economic reform had begun in communist China. Early in the 1980s, the Chinese Communist government loosened its grip on businesses and eliminated some price controls. Students in China, however, began to demand freedom of speech and a greater voice in government, which they did not have. In April of 1989, university students held marches that quickly turned into large demonstrations in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, where students constructed a version of the Statue of Liberty to symbolize their struggle for democracy. The Chinese Communist government quickly ordered the military to crush these protesters. Armed forces stormed into Tiananmen Square on June 3, 1989, slaughtering the unarmed students while the world's democratic countries watched in horror on television. Ironically, Tiananmen means Gate of Heavenly Peace, and hundreds of students were killed or arrested at the end of those protests in Tiananmen Square. The collapse of the pro-democracy movement left the future of China somewhat uncertain for the time being, but communism eventually restored itself and still maintains an iron fist control over the people of China. The Cold War still dominated American policy in Central America and the Caribbean, where the U.S. still opposed left-leaning and socialist governments in favor of governments friendly to the U.S. The United States had maintained a presence in Nicaragua since 1912, when U.S. Marines were sent there to protect U.S. interests. U.S. Marines remained in Nicaragua until 1933 and were pulled out only after helping the dictator Anastasio Somoza come to power. The Somoza family ruled Nicaragua for 42 years. Between 1977 and 1979, Nicaragua was engulfed in a civil war between Somoza's National Guard and the Sandinistas, rebels who took their name from a rebel leader who had been killed in 1934. Sandinistas toppled Somoza's empire, and Carter recognized the new Sandinista government, sending $83 million of economic aid. In 1981, Reagan charged that Nicaragua had become a Soviet outpost that was exporting revolution to other Central American countries. He cut all aid to the Sandinista government and threw his support behind guerrilla forces known as the Contras because they were against communism. By 1983, the Contra Army had grown to 10,000 men, and American CIA officials, without congressional approval, were directing its operations. In response, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, banning military aid to the Contras for 2 years, but Reagan's administration found other ways to get aid to the Contras. In 1983, noting that the island of Grenada was developing ties to communist Cuba, Reagan sent 2,000 Marines to overthrow the pro-Cuban government and establish one friendlier to the U.S. 18 U.S. Marines were killed in this invasion, but Reagan defended the invasion, saying it was necessary to the defense of U.S. security. In Panama in 1989, President George H.W. Bush would send 20,000 U.S. troops to overthrow and arrest General Manuel Noriega, the leader of Panama, on charges of drug trafficking. Noriega had been receiving money since 1960 from the CIA, but was also involved in the drug trade. He was taken by force and in April 1992 was convicted in Miami and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Other hot spots or trouble spots around the world during the administrations of Reagan and Bush were in 1986, Americans were shocked to learn that Reagan had approved the sale of arms to Iran, who was involved in a conflict against Iraq. Part of the profits from these illegal arms sales were sent by the Reagan administration to the Contras in Nicaragua in direct violation of the Boland Amendment. Various members of the Reagan administration were indicted and some were convicted, but the scandal never equaled that of the Watergate scandal. In 1990 and 1991, we saw the Persian Gulf War, the first Persian Gulf War. On August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, invaded his oil-rich neighbor Kuwait in order to steal its wealth to pay off the enormous war debt he had amassed during his prolonged war against Iran in the 1980s. After conquering Kuwait, the Iraqi army appeared poised to threaten Saudi Arabia, and had the Iraqi army invaded Saudi Arabia, Hussein would have controlled one half of the world's oil supplies. With the support of Congress and the United Nations, George H.W. Bush launched Operation Desert Storm, beginning with a massive air campaign on January 16, 1991. On February 23, 1991, the conflict transitioned into a ground war. The Allies launched a successful ground campaign which liberated Kuwait. Bush announced a ceasefire 5 days later on February 28, 1991, but Saddam Hussein was left in power in Iraq. Despite his great achievements in the Persian Gulf War, Bush was not as successful on the domestic front. Rising deficits on a recession that began in 1990 and lasted through most of 1992 hurt him politically. While his popularity rating soared to 89% immediately following the Persian Gulf War, he was forced to raise taxes despite his campaign pledge, read my lips, no new taxes, and his approval rating plummeted to 40% in 1992, an election year. The weak economy and the tax hike doomed Bush's re-election campaign, and 12 years of Republican leadership would come to an end in the election of 1992. In his run for re-election, Bush could not convince the American public that he had a clear strategy for ending the recession and creating jobs. His opponents in the 1992 election were the Democratic governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, and third-party candidate H. Ross Perot. Clinton's middle-of-the-road approach appealed to many voters, and he won 43% of the popular vote, while Bush won 38%, and Perot managed a very respectable 19%. Clinton won the White House in part by promising to move away from traditional Democratic policies. He emphasized the need to move people off welfare and called for growth in private business as a means to economic progress. In doing so, Clinton sought to create a new, more inclusive Democratic Party. Clinton pledged to create a plan to guarantee affordable health care for all Americans. He appointed First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton to lead the team creating the plan. The president presented this health care reform bill to Congress in September 1993, and although Congress debated the plan for more than a year, Republicans attacked the plan as just another Democratic attempt to promote big government. This sealed the bill's doom. Congress never even voted on it. Clinton was more successful in his efforts to reduce the federal budget deficit. Clinton and the Republican-controlled Congress, working together, passed legislation calling for a balanced budget by 2002 in 1997. 1 year later, in 1998, Clinton announced that for the first time in 30 years, the federal budget actually had a surplus. This surplus was used in part to pay down the federal debt, which had soared to $5.5 trillion. Clinton and conservative Republicans also cooperated to reform the welfare system. In 1996, a bill was passed to place limits on how long people could receive welfare benefits. Over the next few years, states moved millions of people from welfare to jobs. The transition was more successful because of the strong national economy. In regard to foreign policy, throughout the 1990s, the United States and Russia cooperated on economic and arms control issues, but Russia criticized U.S. intervention in Yugoslavia, and the United States protested Russian attacks on rebels in the Russian region of Chechnya. U.S. relations with China were strained as well during the Clinton administration. Under Clinton, the U.S. government leaned on China to give its citizens more democratic rights. But Clinton also emphasized increasing trade with China, sending a mixed foreign policy message. China was also granted permanent trade rights with the U.S. in 2000. Why should China bend to any human rights regards if it was getting what it wanted in the trade sphere? In 1994, Clinton sent troops to Haiti to intervene in what was rapidly becoming a civil war on that island nation. And in 1995, the United States helped broker a peace agreement in Bosnia. Clinton sent U.S. troops to join NATO forces in that region after Yugoslavia broke into 5 nations, and the Serbs began an ethnic cleansing, killing or expelling from their homes people of certain ethnic groups there. In 1998, Serb forces attacked ethnic Albanians in the Serb province of Kosovo. The U.S. and its NATO allies launched airstrikes against Serbian targets in 1999, and the U.S. followed by again participating in an international peacekeeping force. Seeing flourishing trade as essential to U.S. prosperity and world economy and political stability, Clinton championed the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. This legislation would bring Mexico into the free trade zone already formed between the U.S. and Canada. Supporters of NAFTA said that it would strengthen all 3 economies and create more American jobs, but opponents insisted that NAFTA would transfer American jobs to Mexico where wages were lower, and it would harm the environment because of Mexico's weaker anti-pollution laws. Congress rejected these arguments, and NAFTA was signed into law on January 1, 1994, and American jobs immediately began leaving the continental United States for Mexico. Although Clinton and the Republican Congress had worked together on deficit reduction, welfare, and NAFTA, relations in Washington became increasingly partisan. After the failure of Clinton's health care plan and questions regarding his leadership, Republican Congressman Newt Gingrich began to turn voters' dissatisfaction into support for Republicans. In the November 1994 elections, Republicans handed Democrats a humiliating defeat. Voters gave Republicans control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1954. Gingrich was chosen as the new Speaker of the House of Representatives. Clinton immediately clashed with the new Republican-controlled Congress. He opposed Republican budgets, and Congress refused to pass Clinton's larger budgets. The federal government shut down for almost a week in November 1995 because of this impasse, and again for several weeks during the next 2 months. In the 1996 election, the strong economy and passage of welfare reform law of 1996 helped Clinton win re-election against Republican candidate Bob Dole and independent candidate H. Ross Perot, who ran again. Clinton won 49% of the popular vote. The Republicans, however, retained control of both the House and the Senate. In 1994, a federal court appointed an independent counsel to investigate the Clintons on allegations that he had misappropriated funds during his 1984 campaign for governor of Arkansas. The counsel eventually expanded his investigation when he learned that Clinton had had an improper relationship with a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. Furthermore, Clinton had allegedly lied under oath when questioned about the affair. In 1998, as the investigation proceeded, Clinton admitted in a national address that he had indeed engaged in an improper relationship with the intern, but he continued to deny lying under oath about the affair or attempting to obstruct the investigation. In December of 1998, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Clinton, charging the president with perjury and obstruction of justice. Clinton became only the second U.S. president and the first in 130 years to face an impeachment trial in the U.S. Senate. In January of 1999, the Senate opened its trial, which proceeded for 1 month. In the end, the vote to impeach fell just short of the 67 votes, or 2/3 majority, required to convict. Clinton remained in office and apologized for his action. Clinton's remaining 2 years in office were marked by bitter political partisanship that impeded the passage of much-needed legislation. In the 2000 presidential race, Democrats chose Clinton's Vice President Al Gore to run against George W. Bush, governor of Texas and son of the former President George H.W. Bush. Ralph Nader ran for the Green Party, which championed environmental causes and promoted an overall liberal agenda. The election proved to be one of the closest in U.S. history, and it would take over 1 month to determine the winner. As election night progressed, it became clear that whoever won the state of Florida would win the election. And at 2 a.m., the television networks predicted Bush to be the winner. Al Gore called Bush and conceded defeat in the election. But later, Bush's lead appeared to shrink. Gore called Bush back and recanted his concession. By the next day, television stations were reporting that Gore had won the popular vote by more than 500,000 votes cast out of 105 million. But Bush won a razor-thin victory in Florida by 300 votes, giving him a victory in the state and thus the votes in the Electoral College. Thus, the presidency went to George Bush. Democrats immediately called for a recount and contested the election. As Democrats pushed for recounts of the Florida ballots, Republicans sued to stop the recounts. 5 weeks after the election day, the case finally came to the Supreme Court, which voted 5-4 to stop the recounts, thus awarding the Florida electoral votes and the presidency to George Bush. In the wake of the divisive 2000 presidential election, Bush encountered an equally divided Congress. The election produced a 50-50 Republican-Democrat split in the Senate and a slim non-vote Republican majority in the House of Representatives. Bush inherited a large budget surplus and a period of relative economic stability. Public support for Bush remained steady, and he began to advance his political agenda. His support only grew after the terrorist attacks on 9/11. He presented a budget that included $1.6 trillion worth of tax cuts, which was reduced by the Senate to $1.35 trillion over 11 years. He declared plans to reform the federal role in education and privatize Social Security, and he had an early success in resolving a standoff with China over a downed U.S. spy plane. As I mentioned, the 9/11 attacks changed the political landscape in America dramatically, and Bush gained the overwhelming support of Congress and the American people for his handling of that situation. He shifted his administration's energy and attention to combating terrorism. Bush created the Office of Homeland Security and authorized anti-terrorist military operations overseas. He proposed also $125 billion in additional tax cuts and emergency spending, but the remainder of his 2 terms in office would largely be marked by the war on terrorism.